being here. In order to understand what's happening to Greece and to the Greek people, and in order to understand what's coming for other European people, it's important to know the facts. And it's also important to know that there have been gross misrepresentations of the Greek situation, of the Greek crisis during the last 5 years, in order precisely to justify the gross injustice done to the Greek people, and especially to the Greek youth, to the next generations and to the young generations. I will start my presentation by a metaphor made by one of the members, one of the people who contributed to the Truth Committee on Public Debt, the Debt Truth Committee, which was founded by President's decision at the Greek Parliament on April the 4th. This is a metaphor by a young student, a person who was very active in the social movements, asking for an audit of the debt ever since 2011. Imagine that you wake up in the middle of the open sea. You look around you and it's dark. There's no sign of land. You're in a boat with rowing paddles. You have no idea how you got there. All you know is you have to row the paddles in the hope to arrive to the land. This is what actually happened to the Greek people back in 2010. Without being asked, without being warned, they were suddenly told that the Greek economy is sinking like the Titanic. It was actually the Greek Minister of Finance, Mr. Konstantopoulou, who made this public statement and who announced to the people that the country was over-indebted and in the verge of bankruptcy. The people were thrown into boats. They were forced to make sacrifices to save an economy which had been destroyed during the last 36 years by two governing parties, PASOK, the so-called Socialist Party, and Nea Demokratia, the right-wing party, for 36 years, ever since 1974. The people were depicted in the international media as lazy, corrupt, and living beyond their means. They were threatened each time an election was coming, with a clear warning that electing a party other than those who had destroyed the country would mean a disaster. They were particularly warned not to elect the Syriza radical left party, which was asking for an audit of the debt, a debt relief for the larger part of the debt, and a moratorium of repayments until growth was obtained for the country and for its people, in the model of the debt relief accorded to Germany in 1953. For almost 5 years, it was not the Greek people making sacrifices, but rather it was the government sacrificing the people for the sake of saving themselves, under the pretext of saving the economy or the country and diminishing the debt. To get a clear picture of what salvation looks like, of what these bailout agreements for Greece meant, the following numbers are pretty much telling. Unemployment rates rose from 9.7% in 2009 to 27% in 2015, with youth unemployment reaching the unprecedented rate of 60% among young men and 72% among young women. In numbers, this means 1.5 million unemployed persons in an active population of 3.5 million. A suicide epidemic led to a loss of thousands of lives out of despair. Almost 300,000 households were left without electricity for months or even years, and there were several deaths reported among children or among the elderly or among students out of suffocation or fire from self-made heating machines. Half of the children in Greece are still living below the poverty line. Schools have been operating without books, without heating, and without teachers. And young pupils are often reported to faint at school out of starvation. Hospitals operate with one nurse for 40 patients, and time and again we have experienced periods during which cancer patients were deprived of access to medicine to combat their illness. 44.8% of pensioners receive pensions well below the poverty line. Hundreds of thousands of small and medium enterprises have been shut down. The country has lost around 25% of its GDP, and hundreds of thousands of young people are forced to emigrate. Most of them are scientists holding several degrees. All this has been the result of severe measures agreed ever since May 2010 between Greek governments and a trio of institutions called the Troika, consisting in the European Commission, the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, which became Greece's creditors in the place of its former creditors. The agreements between Greece and the Troika were called Memoranda of Understanding, and they were linked to loan agreements given to Greece to repay its supposed debt. All these agreements were enforced through laws passed in parliaments through extraordinary, anti-constitutional, anti-democratic procedures. Laws of hundreds of pages construed in one single or maybe 2 or 3 articles, inserted and voted upon in less than 48 hours under the explicit threat that they would either be approved by Parliament or the next installment of loans to Greece would not be disbursed. The country was asked to sell out its public property and public enterprises at extremely low prices to repay the debt. These policies were also promoted through police brutality, including not only physical violence but also dangerous chemicals. Military measures such as the enlistment of those in strike were also used as a tool to obtain obedience. Workers at the public transport, at the naval transport, at the public energy enterprise, as well as teachers who were on strike, were enlisted as posing a threat to public order or public health. And during all this time, there was absolutely no sign of growth, no sign of recovery of the economy. Rather, the country is going through the longest recession, 7 years, ever experienced in Europe at a time of peace. The population is subject to a humanitarian crisis directly linked with the so-called bailout measures. And as for the debt, well, the debt has risen from less than 120% of the GDP before the several bailouts to more than 180% and rising. Meanwhile, representatives of those involved in the crafting and drafting these monstrous agreements have repeatedly made public admissions on being wrong in their calculations. On January 25th, 2015, the Greek people, through general elections, gave a clear and unequivocal mandate to government and to parliament to do away with the memoranda, to do away with its disastrous and homicidal policies, to do away with austerity, and to demand an alleviation of the country's debt. On April 4th, 2015, a special committee of the Parliament was formed called the Truth Committee on Public Debt to conduct an audit and a legal assessment of the debt. The committee, of which Oslam is a member, and also Christina Laskaridis, who I see at the back over there, is also a member, issued its preliminary report, the one you already have in your hands, in June 2015, just like it had announced. The report found Greece's sovereign debt to be illegal, illegitimate, odious, and wholly unsustainable. It found that the sovereign debt had been concluded through unconstitutional and illegal procedures, violating parliamentary process, fundamental human rights and freedoms as set out in international treaties and international law. It further found that Greece's creditors had been acting in bad faith ever since 2010, knowingly burdening the country with unsustainable loans and turning what was a private debt into public debt to save French, German, and at a later stage, Greek private banks, to the detriment of the Greek people who were attacked by a taxation and austerity tsunami as a means to support the recapitalization of the banking system. The Debt Truth Committee, through the disclosure of documents contained in criminal case files, which had been kept secret in Parliament for as long as almost 2.5 years, as well as through hearings to which Özlem previously referred, revealed that the IMF and its member states, that is, all the member states of the European Union, had known ever since March 2010 that the Greek debt was unsustainable, ever since March 2010. The IMF and its member states knew ever since March 2010 that measures contained in the very first Memorandum of Understanding were bound to provoke deep and lasting recession and a disruption of the social tissue. The committee and its reports revealed that French and German banks profited from their knowledge that the Greek debt was unsustainable and got rid of the Greek state bonds they were holding between 2010 and 2011, so before the big haircut of the public debt, thereby gaining dozens of billions of dollars. It further revealed that when Greek banks, social security funds, 15,000 petty bondholders, and public sector institutions were destroyed by the same haircuts effectuated in 2011, it was only the Greek private banks which were rescued. The report also shows that, contrary to what is being said and what is being repeated by the media, public expenses of Greece at every domain are well below the European average, with the sole exception of defense expenses, where you have the largest scale corruption and economic criminality detected, and tens of criminal case files opened by the corruption prosecutor against former government officials and government members. Despite these revelations, Greece's creditors insisted that the Greek people continue to pay the price and to repay a debt that had reached, at that point, 325 billion euros, which means that every baby born in Greece is indebted by 32,500 euros, or rather was indebted by that sum at that point before the third memorandum. On June 25th, 2015, that was a week after the committee's report was issued and publicized, a 48-hour ultimatum was addressed to the Greek government by the European institutions, basically by the Eurogroup and the Euro Summit, asking the Greek government to accept, contrary to popular mandate, contrary to the mandate of the 25th of January, a series of measures dismantling labor law, abolishing social security guarantees and legal protection for over-indebted citizens, and demanding the sellout of the most precious public assets and public enterprises, major ports, airports, and public infrastructure, to repay an unsustainable and odious debt. A debt which continued to be misleadingly represented as sustainable. On June 27th, upon government's proposal, a referendum on the ultimatum was decided by the Hellenic Parliament to be held on July 5th, 2015. During the referendum week, international and foreign officials made repeated statements concerning the referendum outcome and addressed explicit and implicit threats to the population in case the people rejected the measures. The referendum was held with the banks closed and capital controls imposed for more than a week due to the European Central Bank's refusal to provide a week's liquidity after the referendum was decided. And yet, democracy prevailed, and the people, by a 62% no vote, rejected the disastrous measures. This is the big orgy to which Oslam referred to. 3 days before the referendum, the International Monetary Fund, through a draft report, made an official public admission for the first time that the Greek debt is unsustainable. The report was dated June 26, 2015, and was kept concealed from the people for almost a week. What followed the referendum outcome is a true nightmare and a disgrace for Europe, for the world, and for democracy. The creditors refused to consider, let alone respect, the referendum outcome. They insisted, under the threat of provoking a bank failure and a humanitarian disaster to which they referred specifically, that measures harsher than those rejected be adopted. The government was forced to accept that Parliament legislates on pre-formulated texts of hundreds of pages with no deliberation at prefixed dates, regardless of the Parliament's program, with an emergency procedure and with the banks still closed. This extortion was baptized prerequisites for an agreement, and Parliament was called to abolish